I let them talk over me, ignore me, and underestimate me, until the system finally broke and suddenly the same people were waiting for me to speak. The first thing you need to understand is this. People always assume that if you're quiet, you don't know what you're doing. I used to sit in those meetings, watching grown adults fight for attention like it actually meant something. Voices overlapping, people cutting each other off, everyone trying to sound like the smartest guy in the room. It wasn't about solving problems. It was about winning the moment. And me? I just sat there. Not because I didn't have anything to say. Truth is, most of the time, I had a pretty good idea of what was wrong before the conversation even started. But I learned early on that it didn't matter. In that room, logic didn't win, volume did. There was one meeting I still think about. We were dealing with a system that was falling apart. Missed deadlines, lost shipments, clients getting impatient. It was serious. The kind of issue that could cost people their jobs. But instead of fixing it, everyone turned it into a show. Mark, our team lead, kept talking over people like he had something to prove. Greg jumped in every chance he got, throwing out ideas that sounded good on the surface but didn't hold up if you thought about them for more than 10 seconds. Jenna tried to bring up actual data, real numbers, but no one let her finish. I just sat there, writing things down. At one point, Mark looked at me and said, "You've been quiet. Got anything to add?" Every head turned, and I just shook mine. That moment pretty much defined how they saw me after that. Quiet, passive, not leadership material. I heard it more than once. Sometimes behind my back, sometimes not even quietly. They thought I didn't understand the bigger picture. That part almost made me laugh. Because the truth was, I probably understood it better than anyone in that room. I saw how Greg's confidence covered up weak ideas. I saw how Mark avoided responsibility by shifting blame. I saw how Jenna was the only one actually paying attention to the data, even if no one listened to her. And most importantly, I saw how the same mistakes kept happening over and over again. Nobody noticed that I was noticing. That was the advantage. I didn't argue, didn't interrupt, didn't try to prove anything. I let them think I was just the quiet guy who did his work and stayed out of the way. But while they were busy talking, I was paying attention. And the more I paid attention, the more I started to realize something didn't feel right. This wasn't just a messy system. It felt like people were making the same bad decisions over and over again. And once that thought hit me, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Once that thought got into my head, I couldn't shake it. At first, I told myself I was overthinking it. Every workplace has problems. Every system has flaws. But this felt different. It wasn't just messy, it was predictable. The same breakdowns, the same delays, the same unexpected issues that somehow kept happening in almost identical ways. And nobody questioned it. They just argued about it. Week after week, meeting after meeting, I watched the same pattern play out. Someone would point out a problem. Someone else would deflect. Voices would rise. Blame would shift. And by the end of it, nothing actually changed. Except the narrative. I started paying closer attention, not just to what people said, but to what they avoided saying. Like how certain reports were always incomplete, right when deadlines hit. Or how specific vendors kept getting approved, even though they were the source of half our delays. Or how Mark would shut down conversations the moment they got too close to something real. That's when I started keeping records. Nothing dramatic, just notes, dates, patterns, small things that didn't seem important on their own, but started forming a bigger picture when you stack them together. And I did it quietly. Nobody noticed. Why would they? In their eyes, I was still the same guy. Head down. No opinions. No ambition beyond getting through the day. I let them believe that. Meanwhile, I started testing things. Small adjustments. Minor changes to how I handled my part of the workflow. Nothing big enough to draw attention, but enough to see what would happen. And things started to shift. Not everywhere. Just in my corner. Tasks that usually got delayed started moving faster. Errors dropped. Communication got clearer. It wasn't perfect, but it was working. Better than before. That's when I realized something important. The system didn't have to be broken. It was being kept that way. I didn't know why yet. Not fully, but I could feel it. There were too many coincidences pointing in the same direction. And once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. That's when I made a decision. I stopped thinking of myself as just an employee and started thinking like someone building something. Quietly, in the background, while everyone else was still arguing over pieces of a system they didn't even understand. I was starting to understand all of it. And I had a feeling. If I kept going like this, eventually, something was going to break. Not the system. Something bigger. Once I started looking at everything differently, it stopped feeling like a job. It felt more like watching a machine from the inside. Every process, every delay, every argument, it all started to connect. And the more I paid attention, the more I realized something uncomfortable. Some decisions didn't make sense unless you looked at who benefited from them. Not in an obvious way. Nothing you could point at and say, there, that's the problem. It was subtle. Small decisions that didn't make sense. Approvals that shouldn't have gone through. Deadlines that got pushed for no real reason. And the same names kept coming up. Greg was one of them. On the surface, he looked like the kind of guy who just talked too much and thought too highly of himself. But once I started digging, even just casually, just observing, I noticed something else. His ideas didn't just fail. They failed in ways that created more work, more confusion, more reliance on fixing things later. And somehow, he always ended up involved in the fixes too. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Then I stopped believing in coincidence. I didn't say anything. I didn't confront anyone. That would have been pointless. I didn't have proof, just patterns. And patterns don't mean much to people who only listen to whoever talks the loudest. So I kept going the way I had been. Quiet. Observing. Building. I started expanding beyond my own tasks. Not officially. Nothing anyone could call out. But I paid attention to adjacent workflows. Learned how different parts of the system connected. Who handled what. Where things slowed down. It was like mapping out a city no one else realized they were living in. And the more complete that map got, the more one thing became clear. If someone understood all of it, they could control it. Not in some power-hungry way, just practically, because everyone else only saw their piece. I was starting to see the whole. That's when things shifted a little. Not publicly, not in a way anyone announced. But people started coming to me. At first, it was small. Jenna asked me once if I could double-check a dataset. Said she trusted my eye for detail. I didn't think much of it, but I helped. Then someone from another team asked if I knew why a process kept stalling. I gave a short answer. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to point them in the right direction. Word started spreading. Not loud. Not obvious. But enough. People didn't suddenly see me as a leader. They just started relying on me. Quietly. And I let that happen too. Because the truth was, I wasn't trying to be seen. I was trying to understand. But the more people started depending on me, the more I realized something else. I wasn't just observing the system anymore. I was becoming part of what kept it running. And that was dangerous. Because if I was right about what was really going on, then sooner or later, someone was going to notice me. The first time I realized people were actually depending on me, it didn't feel like a win. It felt like a risk. Because up until then, I had been invisible. And invisible is safe. Nobody questions you. Nobody watches you. You get to move freely, pick things apart, understand how everything works without anyone asking why. But once people start noticing you, even a little, that changes. It started small. Jenna began looping me into things she didn't trust others with. Not officially, of course. She'd just send something over with a quick note like, "Can you take a look?" No pressure. No spotlight. But it meant something. Then it spread. Other teams started reaching out. Quietly. Almost like they didn't want to admit they needed help. Quick questions. Have you seen this before? Does this look right to you? Stuff like that. I never over-explained. Never tried to sound smarter than I was. Short answers. Clear. Useful. And that was enough. Meanwhile, the usual noise kept going. Meetings were still loud. Arguments still pointless. Greg still dominated every room he walked into, throwing out ideas like he was solving everything on the fly. Mark still backed whatever sounded confident enough in the moment. But something started to feel off. Not in the system. In the reactions. There were moments, small ones, where I'd give a quiet suggestion before a meeting just to someone on the side. And then, in the meeting, that same idea would come up through someone else, and suddenly it would be accepted. No pushback. No argument. Same idea. Different voice. That told me everything I needed to know. It was never about the solution. It was about who said it. I didn't react to that. Didn't correct anyone. Didn't try to claim credit. I just adjusted. If that's how the system worked, then fine. I'd work within it. That's when I started being more deliberate. Still quiet. Still in the background. But now I paid attention to who listened to who influenced decisions without being obvious about it, who people trusted, even when they shouldn't. And slowly, I started placing things. Ideas. Timing. Information. Nothing big enough to draw attention. Just small nudges in the right direction. A suggestion here. A clarification there. Always through the right person. Always at the right moment. And things started moving. Not perfectly, but better. Faster. Cleaner. And nobody connected it back to me, which was exactly how I wanted it. But then something happened I didn't expect. Mark called me into his office. No warning. No explanation. Just a message. Got a minute? I remember sitting there across from him, trying to read his expression. He leaned back in his chair, studying me like he was trying to figure something out. And then he said something that caught me off guard. You've been more involved lately. That was it. Not an accusation. Not a compliment. Just an observation. But the way he said it, it felt like he was starting to see through something. And for the first time since all of this started, I wasn't sure if staying quiet was enough anymore. I didn't answer right away. When Mark said that, you've been more involved lately, I just sat there for a second, like I was weighing how much he actually knew. Because that was the thing. If he was just guessing, I could brush it off. Stay in the background. Keep things the way they were. But if he'd been paying attention, that changed things. So I kept it simple. Just trying to make things run smoother. I said. Nothing defensive. Nothing that stood out. He nodded slowly, like he was testing the answer against something in his head. Then he leaned forward a little, resting his arms on the desk. You ever think about stepping up more? He asked. That caught me off guard. Not because I hadn't thought about it, but because he was the one saying it. This was the same guy who usually backed the loudest voice in the room. The same guy who overlooked people like me without a second thought. And now suddenly, he was asking. I didn't answer right away again. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I didn't trust the question. So I gave him something neutral. I'm fine where I am. He watched me for a moment, then leaned back again. There was this look on his face, not disappointment, not approval, just curiosity, like I didn't fit the version of me he had in his head. All right, he said finally. Just thought I'd ask. That was it. Meeting over. But something about that conversation stuck with me. Not the offer. The timing. Because right around then, things started getting worse. Not in obvious ways. Not the kind you could point at and say, everything's falling apart. It was more subtle than that. Delays started stacking faster than usual. Fixes weren't holding. Problems that should have been solved kept coming back like nothing had changed. Even the loud voices in the room started sounding strained. Less confident. More reactive. Like they were losing control of something they didn't fully understand. And for the first time, I noticed something else. People weren't just coming to me for small things anymore. They were coming to me before decisions were made. Quietly. Carefully. Like they trusted me more than the people actually in charge. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about understanding the system anymore. Without realizing it, I was starting to influence it. And if that was true, then Mark's question wasn't random. He wasn't offering me a chance to step up. He was trying to figure out how much I already had. That's when I stopped pretending this was just observation. Up until then, I'd been careful, watching, learning, adjusting in small ways that didn't draw attention. But now people were already looking in my direction, even if they didn't fully realize it yet. So I leaned into it. Still quiet. Still in the background. But more intentional. I started connecting things. When someone came to me with a problem, I didn't just answer it. I traced it. Where it started, who touched it, where it slowed down. I built a mental chain for everything. And after a while, those chains started overlapping. That's when the bigger picture finally came into focus. It wasn't just Greg. There were others. Different departments. Different roles. But the same pattern. Decisions that didn't make sense unless you looked at who benefited from the chaos. Because chaos creates dependency. And dependency gives certain people control. That realization sat heavy with me. I remember one night staying late, long after most people had gone home. Just me, the low hum of the office, and a screen full of data that finally lined up the way it was supposed to. And there it was. Clear as day. The system wasn't just messy. It stayed that way because no one really fixed the root problems. Not in some dramatic, obvious conspiracy, but through small, consistent choices. Delays here. Miscommunication there. Just enough friction to keep things unstable, but not enough to collapse completely. Controlled instability. I leaned back in my chair and just stared at the screen for a while. Because once you see something like that, you can't go back to pretending it's normal. And that's when the real question hit me. What do you do when you understand a system better than the people running it? Do you fix it? Or do you use it? I didn't answer that right away. Instead, I did what I'd always done. I kept working. But this time, I wasn't just improving my corner. I started building something underneath everything else. A cleaner process. A more stable flow. Quiet fixes that stacked on top of each other. Not visible on the surface, but strong enough to hold things together when everything else started slipping. And slowly, very slowly, some parts of the system started relying on what I was building, without anyone realizing it. That should have felt like progress. But instead, it felt like standing in the middle of something unstable, holding weight no one else even knew existed. Because if I was right, then sooner or later, something was going to force all of this into the open. And when that happened, there wasn't going to be any room left to stay quiet. It didn't take long for something to go wrong. Not a small issue. Not one of those routine delays everyone was used to arguing about. This one hit fast, and it hit everything at once. Orders started backing up across multiple teams. Systems weren't syncing. Clients were calling in, frustrated, asking questions no one had clear answers to. And just like always, the first reaction wasn't to fix it. It was noise. Meetings got pulled together within hours. People talking over each other, trying to figure out who to blame before they even understood what happened. Greg was louder than usual, throwing out explanations that didn't line up. Mark kept jumping between ideas, trying to regain control of the room. Same pattern, just bigger. I sat there, like I always did, listening. But this time, something was different. Because while they were trying to figure out what went wrong, I already knew. I'd seen the pressure building for weeks. Small failures stacking on top of each other, hidden under quick fixes and ignored warnings. The kind of thing you only notice if you've been paying attention the whole time. And now it had finally collapsed. Not completely, but enough. Enough that the usual noise wasn't going to fix it. That's when I noticed something else. Jenna wasn't speaking. Not because she didn't have anything to say, but because she was watching me, waiting. And she wasn't the only one. A couple of others, people who had come to me quietly before, were doing the same thing. Not obvious. Not something anyone else in the room would catch. But I saw it. They weren't looking at Mark. They weren't listening to Greg. They were waiting for me. That wasn't part of the plan. I felt it then, that shift. Subtle, but real. The room was still loud, still chaotic, still pretending like control was sitting at the head of the table. But underneath all of that, the weight had already started moving. And the worst part? I wasn't ready for it to land on me. Because once you step in at a moment like that, there's no going back to being invisible. And as the arguing kept getting louder, Mark suddenly slammed his hand on the table and said something that changed everything. Enough. Someone give me a real answer. And for a second, the room went quiet. Not completely. Just enough. Just long enough. A few people looked my way. Not everyone. Just enough that I knew I couldn't stay quiet this time. I wish I could say I had some big, confident moment planned. I didn't. When everyone looked at me, it felt like the air got heavier. Not dramatic, just real. Like the room finally stopped pretending. For a second, I thought about staying quiet. Letting someone else jump in. That would have been easier. Safer. But no one did. Even Greg, for once, didn't fill the silence. So I leaned forward slightly, hands still resting on the table, and said the first thing that actually mattered. It's not one issue, I said. It's a chain. That got their attention. Not because it was loud, but because it was clear. I didn't rush it. Didn't try to dominate the room the way they usually did. I just laid it out, piece by piece. Where the delays started. How they stacked. Why the fixes weren't holding. I kept it simple. And for the first time since I'd been in that company, for once, people actually let me finish. You could feel it shifting. Not loudly. Not all at once. But the usual tension, the constant push to be heard. It just wasn't there. I pointed out how certain approvals kept creating bottlenecks. How rushed decisions led to repeated failures. How the same quick fixes were actually making things worse over time. I didn't name people. Not yet. I just described the system. And the more I spoke, the quieter the room got. Because they recognized it. Maybe not fully. Maybe not all the way. But enough to know this wasn't just another opinion thrown into the mix. This was accurate. Mark didn't say anything for a while. He just watched me, the way he had in his office. But now there was something different in his expression. Less curiosity. More realization. Finally, he asked, "So what's the fix?" That question landed differently than anything else. Because now it wasn't about being heard. It was about responsibility. And that's where everything I'd been building in the background came into play. I paused for just a second, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I understood what saying it would mean. Then I said it. There's already a structure that works, I told him. It's just not the one we've been using. A few people shifted in their seats. Confused. Maybe even uncomfortable. Mark narrowed his eyes slightly. What do you mean? He asked. And that was the moment I realized. I wasn't explaining anymore. I was about to show them something they didn't even know existed. And once I did, there was no way any of them were going to look at me the same again. I didn't stand up. Didn't pull up slides. Didn't make it a show. I just reached into my bag, took out my notebook, and slid it onto the table. It didn't look like much. Just pages. Notes. Diagrams that only made sense if you'd been tracking things for a long time. I've been running a parallel flow, I said. Calm. Steady. Not officially. Just testing. You could feel the shift immediately. Confusion first. Then tension. Mark leaned forward, flipping through a couple of pages. His expression tightened the more he looked. This is current? He asked. I nodded. It's already handling part of the load. That's why some areas haven't completely failed yet. That got reactions. Not loud ones, but you could see it in their faces. People connecting dots they hadn't even realized were there. Jenna leaned in slightly, eyes moving fast across the notes. She got it quicker than most. I could tell. Greg didn't say anything, which, honestly, said more than if he had. Mark looked back up at me. You built this on your own? Not exactly, I said. I just stopped following the broken parts. That answer didn't sit comfortably in the room, because it wasn't just about fixing something anymore. It meant the system they'd been arguing over wasn't even necessary. I let that settle for a second. Then I kept going. The current structure creates delays on purpose, I said. Not openly, but consistently. Certain approvals, certain dependencies, they don't need to be there. Now I saw it. That moment. The one where people stop defending and start realizing. Mark's jaw tightened. Not at me, at what he was starting to understand. I didn't raise my voice. Didn't push. I just said the part that mattered. If we switch to this flow, we remove most of the bottlenecks immediately. Work moves cleaner, faster, fewer points of failure. Silence. Real silence this time. Then Mark asked the question that changed everything. Who's responsible for the current structure? There it was. The line nobody had crossed before. I looked at him. Then, slowly, I answered. Not one person. That was the truth. But it wasn't the whole truth. And he knew it. The room felt tighter now. Heavier. Like everyone was waiting for the next piece. Because they understood what was coming. If this was real, then someone had allowed it to stay broken. And as Mark closed the notebook slowly, eyes still on me, I realized something. This wasn't about fixing a system anymore. This was about exposing it. And once that started, there was no controlling what came next. After that, nobody argued. That was the strangest part. All those voices, the same ones that used to fill every second of every meeting, they just stopped. Not completely, but enough that you could feel the difference. Mark looked at it for a while, then said, we should test this. Just like that. No long debate. Just a decision. And for once, no one pushed back. Because they knew. Maybe not every detail. Maybe not the full picture I'd been building quietly for months. But enough to understand that whatever we had been doing before wasn't working. And this was. The next few days were different. Not smooth. Not perfect. But focused. People stopped trying to be the loudest. They started asking questions that actually mattered. Jenna worked closer with me, refining things faster than I could have done alone. Even some of the people who used to dominate conversations started stepping back. Greg didn't. He tried, but it didn't land the same anymore. Because once people see how things really work, confidence without substance doesn't hold up. And then came the part one knew was inevitable. Accountability. Not loud, not dramatic, but real. Processes changed. Roles shifted. Certain decisions stopped going through the same hands they always had. And some people, quietly, were no longer part of those decisions at all. No big announcement. Just a shift. As for me, I didn't suddenly become a different person. I still don't talk much. But now, when I do, people listen. Not because I'm louder, but because I don't speak unless it matters. That meeting, the one where everything changed, it taught me something I wish I'd understood earlier. You don't need to fight for attention to have control. You don't need to win every argument to shape the outcome. Sometimes it's less about talking more, and more about actually understanding what's going on. And wait, because when the moment comes, you won't need to raise your voice. The room will already be quiet.